The story of Cattle Kate, also known as Ellen Watson, embodies the malevolence and tragedy that often characterized life on the American frontier. Born into humble beginnings in Canada, Ellen's journey led her to the vast expanses of Wyoming. Misrepresented by sensationalized accounts in the press, Watson faced a fate that would immortalize her as a martyr of the Old West. Despite being depicted as a villain, those who truly knew Ellen spoke of her kindness and resilience. Her life and legacy reflects the injustices faced by those who dared to challenge the status quo in the untamed frontier. This is her story. Ellen Liddy Watson, better known by her nickname Ella, was born on July 2, 1861, to Thomas Lewis Watson and Frances Close Watson, hailing from Erin Lake, Bruce County, Ontario, Canada. She was the eldest among 10 surviving siblings. Growing up, Watson assisted with household chores and received her education in a modest, one-room schoolhouse, where she acquired literacy skills. In 1877, the Watson family relocated to Lebanon, Kansas, where her father claimed a homestead. Shortly after settling in, Watson ventured to Smith Center, Kansas, where she secured employment as a cook and housekeeper for H.R. Stone. It was during this time that she crossed paths with William A. Pickell, a farm laborer. Their union culminated in marriage on November 24, 1879, when Watson was just 18 and Pickell 21. An old wedding portrait depicts Watson as a tall, square-faced woman. However, the bliss of marriage soon turned sour as Watson endured verbal and physical abuse from Pickell, who also struggled with alcoholism. Reports indicate that he frequently subjected Watson to beatings with a horsewhip. Unable to endure the torment, Watson sought refuge at her parents' residence by January 1883. Pickell attempted to bring her back, but Thomas Watson's imposing frame was enough to dissuade him and send Pickell packing for good. Eventually, she relocated to Red Cloud, Nebraska, more than 10 miles distant from her familial abode, in a bid to distance herself further from her estranged spouse. In Red Cloud, Watson found employment at the Royal Hotel, where she worked for a year while establishing residency. It was from this base that she initiated divorce proceedings, filing for divorce on Valentine's Day of 1884. In that same year, contrary to her family's wishes, she ventured to Denver, Colorado, to reunite with one of her brothers residing there, although her stay was brief. She journeyed onward to Cheyenne, Wyoming. It was a rare occurrence during that era for a woman to embark on such travels independently, but she secured employment yet again as both a seamstress and a cook. However, Watson found Cheyenne to be disagreeable, prompting her relocation to Rawlins, Wyoming in late 1885 or early 1886. There, she secured a position as a cook and waitress at the esteemed Rawlins House, the town's foremost boarding establishment. Watson has often been erroneously associated with prostitution due to misconceptions about the Rawlins House's nature. On February 24, 1886, Watson encountered James "Jim" Averill, a charismatic and enterprising young man, during his visit to Rawlins to file a homestead claim for land near the Sweetwater River, approximately 1 mile from the Oregon, Mormon, and California trails. The attraction between them was immediate, and they commenced a courtship soon thereafter. So, who exactly was James Averill? James Averill entered the world on March 20th, 1851, in Renfrew County, Ontario, Canada, as the youngest of 7 children to John and Sarah Ann Averill. Tragically, his father passed away shortly after his birth. At the age of 20, Averell ventured to the United States, where he enlisted in the military. Initially stationed at Fort Douglas, Utah, he was later transferred to Fort Fred Steele, Wyoming, located 15 miles east of Rawlins. Following his discharge in 1876, he promptly re-enlisted, this time serving at Fort McKinley, Wyoming, near Buffalo. During his time in Buffalo, Averell found himself in a fateful encounter with a man named Charlie Johnson, known for his combative nature, especially when under the influence of alcohol. Averell claimed self-defense, stating that Johnson had threatened him with a knife on numerous occasions. In a confrontation, Averell shot Johnson, resulting in his death. Despite being detained in Rawlins while grand jurors deliberated, Averell was never convicted and was eventually released. Averell sought solace in homesteading, establishing his first homestead on Cherry Creek at the northern base of Ferris Mountain. He married Sophia Jaeger on February 23, 1882, but tragedy struck soon after with the premature birth and subsequent passing of their baby boy. Sophia also fell ill to what was then termed childbed fever and passed away. Overwhelmed by grief, Averell sold the homestead and resettled about 15 miles north, situated between Horse Creek and the Sweetwater River. In addition to his homesteading endeavors, Averell ventured into entrepreneurship, opening a general store and tavern on his land. The strategic location of his property near the Oregon and Mormon trails contributed to the success of his businesses. Upon meeting Ella Watson, Averell extended an invitation for her to join him at his homestead. Recognizing her culinary skills, he proposed that she cook meals for the hungry travelers, allowing her to charge 50 cents per meal and retain all the earnings. He also suggested that she could potentially homestead her own adjacent tract of land. Ella accepted the offer, and soon she found herself residing in picturesque Sweetwater Valley. After Ella's divorce was finalized in March 1886, just a few months elapsed before James and Ella sought a marriage license in Lander, Wyoming. However, whether the couple actually tied the knot remains uncertain, as the completed application never surfaced. Some speculate that they intended to marry after Ella established her own homestead, as regulations at the time permitted only one claim per family. The legality of their union remains ambiguous, though historians lean toward the likelihood of a secret marriage. This clandestine arrangement allowed Watson to pursue land ownership under the Homestead Act of 1862, which permitted single women to acquire 160 acres of land, contingent upon its improvement within 5 years. On June 29, 1886, Jim assumed the role of postmaster in the nearby community he helped establish, alongside his appointment as Justice of the Peace. Meanwhile, residing with Averell at his residence, Ella contributed to the operation of his general store and cafe. Over time, Ella diligently saved her earnings and eventually invested in cattle, using funds to trade with passing immigrants on the trails. She fenced approximately 60 acres of her land using barbed wire, but this proved insufficient for her modest herd's grazing needs. During this time, numerous ranchers relied on public land for grazing their cattle. In August of '86, Watson asserted squatters' rights to the land adjoining Averell's property. Upon settling on this adjacent land, she erected a modest 2-room log house and commenced the laborious task of digging irrigation ditches to facilitate her agricultural pursuits. This is where the real trouble began. Ella made efforts to register a brand for her cattle, but faced rejection due to the Maverick Law, enacted in 1884. This legislation stipulated that unbranded calves discovered on the open range, could not be simply taken off the range by anyone. Instead, they were to be branded on the neck with an M, designating them as the exclusive property of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, or WSGA. The WSGA, composed of influential individuals who held sway over Wyoming's cattle industry, also assumed the role of the official law enforcement agency for the state's cattle industry. Formed in 1872, the WSGA emerged from a coalition of approximately 24 cattlemen with extensive ranches, aiming to safeguard their rights to the open range. Following substantial losses during the snow winter of 1880 into 1881, when cattle struggled to access grass beneath snowdrifts, ranchers began cultivating hay as an alternative winter feed. Given the region's limited rainfall, securing access to water became vital for ranch survival. Under the Maverick Law, young calves were mandated to be auctioned solely by appointed representatives of the association, with proceeds allocated to cover range policing costs. An amendment in 1886 restricted branding rights solely to those with registered brands from the state. Additionally, small ranchers and homesteaders faced prohibitive barriers, as they were ineligible to bid on unbranded calves unless possessing a registered brand, registration fees for which were prohibitively expensive. Moreover, the brand registration process was subject to the discretion of committees, often influenced by the larger cattle associations. Effectively, the law marginalized small ranchers and homesteaders, inhibiting their ability to compete with the formidable Stock Growers Association, while jeopardizing the safety of their own calves if they wandered off their property. Stray calves were seized by the association and auctioned off. Prominent cattle owners unlawfully staked claims to extensive land areas. By situating movable cabins on these claims and relocating them, they manipulated the Homestead Act's requirement of land improvement. They then perpetuated this cycle to lay claim to multiple homestead properties. So why was Watson and Averell's land so precious to the cattle barons and WSGA at large? It just so happened that territory staked by Watson and Averell commanded a stretch of water spanning 1 mile along Horse Creek. It also probably didn't help that in his capacity as a local justice of the peace, Jim Averell penned correspondence with the newspaper in Casper, Wyoming, highlighting these unjust laws. It was a move that incensed the prominent cattlemen in the regions, for obvious reasons. Over the course of 3 years, Watson and Averell persistently submitted applications for 5 different brands, yet faced rejection each time. Then, on March 23, 1888, Ella formally filed her homestead claim with the land office in Cheyenne. Collectively, with both homesteads, James and Ella now possessed over 320 acres of land. Ella continued to enhance her property by constructing corrals for livestock and fencing a significant portion of the land. The turning point arrived with the appearance of a new governor and mounting pressure from small cattle and landowners. In the fall of that year, Ella acquired 28 head of cattle from a herder transporting them from Nebraska to the Salt Lake Basin. However, upon their arrival in the area, the cattle were weary and in poor condition. On December 3, 1888, she sought to register the WT brand through the Carbon County Brand Committee in Rawlins, but her application was met with rejection yet again. Undeterred, in 1889, Ella purchased a pre-existing brand, LU, derived from the sound of Ella, from nearby rancher John Crowder. Around the same time, Ella informally took in 11-year-old Gene Crowder, John's son, due to his father's inability to care for him. John was a drifter and a drunk, and in no condition to act as a single father. Gene, alongside 14-year-old John L. DeCory, previously employed by Ella, aided in managing the expanding ranch. In April, Ralph Coe, Jim's 20-year-old nephew from Wisconsin, joined the ranch. All the while, her neighbor, B. Frank Buchanan, lent assistance in fence repair and cattle branding. By mid-July 1889, Ella's herd had grown to 41 head of cattle, all bearing her new LU brand. It seemed as if the tide was finally turning for Ella Watson. Unfortunately for her, she had yet to run into her most vile and villainous adversary, lurking just around the corner. Albert John Bothwell, a wealthy cattleman and member of the Stock Association, resided approximately a mile from Jim and Ellen's homestead. Before Ellen claimed her piece of land, Bothwell had been utilizing the property, along with other vast swaths of open range, as grazing grounds for his cattle. Essentially, he treated the entire Sweetwater Valley, extending some 20 miles, as his personal pasture. Despite not owning all the land, Bothwell behaved as if he did. He was notorious in the area for his aggressive stance against homesteaders, aiming to remove them from what he considered his territory. His anger peaked when Jim and Ellen established their homestead on what he viewed as his prime grazing land. Despite making multiple offers to purchase Watson and Averell's property, they steadfastly refused. In what might be seen as retaliation for the repeated rejection of her brand applications, Watson applied for permission to construct a water ditch to irrigate more of her land. This proposed ditch, if constructed, would potentially diminish the water supply available to neighboring ranchers, including Bothwell. Although Jim Averell had granted Bothwell a right-of-way through his property for irrigation purposes, there were instances where Jim had threatened to cut off this water supply, further aggravating Bothwell. Considering these tensions, Bothwell was resolute in his determination to drive Jim and Ellen off their property. Bothwell, who had unlawfully fenced off sections of public land for his own use, began encroaching on Ella's ranch by erecting fences. Upon discovering that Jim had been writing those letters to the Casper newspaper, Bothwell dispatched his cowhands to intimidate the couple. These men would often loiter near the couple's property, keeping a close watch to ensure that they didn't engage in any unusual activity. At times, the cowhands even went so far as to place ominous symbols, like skulls and crossbones, on the couple's doorways. Unfortunately, Jim and Ella seemed unaware of the looming danger. On July 20th, 1889, a stock detective named George Henderson rode through Ellen's pasture at daybreak, coming across cattle branded with fresh LU marks. Henderson, a member of the Stock Association, swiftly raised suspicions about Ella potentially branding cattle illegally. Despite Bothwell being aware that Ella had possessed these cattle for almost a year, he viewed this as an opportunity to finally rid himself of Jim Averell and Ellen Watson. Bothwell urgently summoned other cattlemen for a meeting. While the exact details of their discussion remain unknown, by the end of the meeting, the cattlemen were convinced that Jim and Ellen had stolen the newly branded cattle. One of the men ventured to Ella's pasture to confirm the new brands before returning to inform the others. The men then decided to take matters into their own hands. While some disapproved of Bothwell's plan to lynch the couple, 5 individuals agreed to participate. In total, the group of 6 cattlemen, led by Bothwell, along with M. Ernest McLean, Robert Captain M. Galbraith, John Henry Durbin, Robert Connor, and Tom Sun, rode out to Watson's ranch later that day. Following their meeting, the group decided to visit Ellen's homestead to examine the evidence firsthand. Upon arrival in the early afternoon, they discovered the newly branded cattle, confirming their suspicions. John Durbin, overcome with anger, began dismantling the barbed wire fence and herding the cattle away. Meanwhile, Gene Crowder, the boy informally taken in by Ellen, witnessed McLean and Connors restraining Ella outside, preventing her from returning to her home. At gunpoint, they coerced her onto a buckboard, informing her that she was being arrested for rustling and would be taken to Rawlins. They then set off towards Jim Averill's residence. Despite Crowder's attempt to bypass them, Bothwell detained him, compelling him to stay with Durbin. Jim, who was on his way to Casper, was at the gate when the men approached. Upon stating their intention to arrest him, Jim demanded to see the warrant. Durbin and Bothwell drew their guns in response. Jim was then instructed to unhitch his team and join Ella in the wagon, after which the group began heading north. Young Gene Crowder was permitted to depart and hurried back to Jim's house, where he informed the other ranch hands of the situation. Frank Buchanan promptly mounted his horse and trailed the vigilantes. Buchanan followed the group for approximately 2 miles as they journeyed along the east side of the Averill Mountain before veering southwest across the sagebrush towards the Sweetwater River and Independence Rock. Eventually, the vigilantes halted at the gulch on the river's south side. As Buchanan observed, Bothwell fastened a rope to a tree and looped the other end around Jim's neck, while McLean attempted to do the same to Ella. Witnessing this, Buchanan opened fire on the vigilantes. However, when they retaliated, he fled for his safety. Returning to the ranch, he recounted the events to Gene Crowder, John L. DeCory, and Ralph Coe. Although an inquiry into the hangings commenced promptly, the bodies were left exposed to the sweltering July heat for 2.5 days. A reporter who spoke with members of the posse provided the following account. Hanging from the limb of a stunted pine growing on the summit of a cliff fronting the Sweetwater River were the bodies of James Averill and Ella Watson. Side by side they swing, their arms touching each other, their tongues protruding and their faces swollen and discolored, almost beyond recognition. Common cowboy lariats had been used, and both had died by strangulation, neither fallen over 2 feet. Judging from signs too plain to be mistaken, a desperate struggle had taken place on the cliff, and both man and woman had fought for their lives until the last. Their bodies were removed and transported to Averill's Roadhouse, where Justice of the Peace B.F. Emery, a Casper attorney, administered oaths to those present and conducted an official coroner's inquest. Following the inquiry, he rendered a verdict that John Durbin, Tom Sun, A.J. Bothwell, Robert Connor, and Robert Galbraith, and a man named Ernest McLean were responsible for the deaths. The remains were then transported back to Jim's ranch around 3 o'clock in the morning, July 23, 1889, by E. Joseph Healy, a member of the inquest panel. Ralph Coe and a woman named Jess Lockwood then interred the pair at Jim's ranch. At the time of their demise, Jim was 38 years old, while Ella was just 27. Deputy Philip Watson apprehended the 6 vigilantes and transported them to Carbon County, handing them over to Sheriff Frank Hadsell. The Cheyenne Daily Leader reported the following day, July 26, 1889. A Rawlins telegram says that all the men were arrested by Sheriff Hadsell of Carbon County and given a preliminary hearing yesterday afternoon. Bail was fixed at a $5,000 bond. Each lyncher was allowed to post each other's bond. The grand jury was then convened for August 25, 1889, but before witnesses could testify, they started to mysteriously vanish or die. Shortly after the hangings, young Gene Crowder disappeared without a trace, believed by some to have been taken away by his widowed father to safeguard him from retaliation by powerful members of the Stock Association. John DeCory, Ellen's young assistant, purportedly relocated to Steamboat Springs, Colorado, but was never called to testify. Later, Frank Buchanan also vanished before the hearing, sparking widespread suspicions of foul play, despite the newspaper's contrary claims. Allegedly last seen under protective custody in Cheyenne, Wyoming, Buchanan's whereabouts remained a mystery until a reporter, W.R. Hunt, claimed to have spotted him about a year later. Hunt's notebook, discovered years afterward in a Kansas City resident's attic, chronicled Buchanan's clandestine travels across the country over the following years, evading the powerful cattlemen and fearing for his life. Adding to the intrigue, Ralph Cole, Jim Averill's nephew, died under mysterious circumstances on the very day of the scheduled hearing, most likely due to poisoning. With no witnesses to testify, all charges against the 6 cattlemen were dismissed. The death of Ralph Coe and the disappearances of the key witnesses were never formally investigated. Rumors circulated that Bothwell dispatched his cowhands to intimidate homesteaders and small ranchers, warning them of dire consequences if they dared to testify against the ranchers, suggesting they might meet the same fate as Jim and Ella. A neighbor named Tex later suggested that the entire incident stemmed from land disputes. Averill had challenged Connor's claim to certain land, caused Durbin some trouble during a land validation process, and thwarted Bothwell's efforts to enclose the entire Sweetwater Valley with fencing. Tex also mentioned that Ella Watson had acquired a small herd of cattle through legitimate means, branding them freshly as she had just recently registered a brand. Despite this insight, Tex didn't step forward during the hearing. Similarly, 2 individuals from the local newspaper, the Sweetwater Chief, refrained from coming forward. H.B. Fetz, the newspaper editor, and his assistant, J.N. Spear, had been tipped off by 2 unnamed cattlemen. From the rooftop of the newspaper building, they used field glasses to witness the abduction. Although they observed the angry procession passing nearby, they opted not to testify during the following grand jury hearings in Rawlins. Another witness to the abduction was a man named Dan Fittker. While plowing a hay meadow, Fittker spotted the lynching party in the river bottom, with Buchanan trailing behind. Although Fittker never testified during the hearings, he shared his account with his family years later. Following their deaths, George W. Durant was appointed administrator of their estates. Since the land wasn't legally theirs yet, it had to be relinquished to the government. Ella's property, save for a few personal items, was auctioned off for nearly $323, while Jim's property fetched around $658. Durant also initiated a lawsuit against A.J. Bothwell and John Durbin to reclaim 41 head of cattle, but the case, of course, never reached a verdict. In the same year as the lynching, Albert Bothwell and Tom Sun were appointed to the Wyoming Stock Growers Association Executive Committee, and Captain Galbraith was elected to the legislature. John Durbin served a year on the committee alongside his 2 neighbors in 1894. Several years after Ella's death, Bothwell eventually acquired both homesteads belonging to the deceased victims. He managed his ranch without facing any legal consequences or reprisals until retiring to Los Angeles, where he passed away in the 1920s. The confusion surrounding the entire incident and the misrepresentation of the victims stemmed largely from the negative portrayal by Wyoming newspapers following their deaths. It's believed that these newspapers were influenced by the powerful Stock Growers Association. On the day of Watson and Averell's lynching, George Henderson received a telegram. He promptly visited the Cheyenne Daily Sun and other papers under the influence of the WSGA. The following day, these papers published sensationalized accounts portraying Cattle Kate Watson as a greedy prostitute and cattle rustler, and her partner in crime, James Averell, as a pimp and cold-blooded killer. The editor of the Daily Sun, Ed Towles, penned a 1,300-word article justifying the lynching as a lawless but justifiable deed. He claimed that the cattlemen had been compelled to take such an action due to rampant thievery and warned of further hangings if theft persisted. These articles marked the first instance of cattlemen using the press to justify and glorify their violence, a tactic later resurfaced during the Johnson County War of 1891 and 1892. Contrary to the negative portrayals, those who knew Watson spoke highly of her character. Harry Ward, a stage station operator, described her as a fine-looking woman with a generous heart. Despite being looked down upon by other women, she was known for her kindness and ensured that nobody went hungry around her. Watson's hanging, alongside Averell's, became emblematic of the societal disdain towards cattle rustlers during the late 19th century. The Cattle Kate myth persisted until the late 20th century, when composer George Huffsmith delved into Watson's life for an opera titled The Lynching of Sweetwater. He gathered information from her family and authored a biography shedding light on Watson's true story. In 1989, Watson's relatives erected a marker at her gravesite to honor her memory, and hopefully eradicate the myth of Ellen Liddy Watson as a false outlaw of the Old West. She's as tragic a figure the frontier had ever seen, and may her story reflect this forever.